he and Vexelberg attended Trump's inaugural. There are pictures of them, which is amazing that they would have the gall to photograph at the inaugural.
How Russia invaded America, not with soldiers, but with a mind-bending web of money. This is the Beyond Politics podcast. I'm Matt Robeson. In 2015, there was a Russian invasion of a kind. Russia began to infiltrate our politics, and they didn't use tanks. They had a two-pronged approach. One was disinformation and influence, and that's what the Mueller investigation ended up being about. The other part was a howitzer of money that flowed from Russian oligarchs into political campaigns, almost exclusively Republicans, and not just Donald Trump's. And now some of those names that came up back in 2015 through 2016 have reemerged in 2023, especially in the wake of the arrest of Charles McGonigal, the senior FBI official who was supposed to be in charge of stopping this stuff and instead turned around and went to work for the Russians. And that spawns a whole bunch more questions about what is happening now. The person who put together that great, most succinct, and most insightful summary of all of this, Ruth May. Dr. May is a business professor at the University of Dallas, now retired, and an expert on the economies of Russia and Ukraine. She wrote an article for the Dallas Morning News in 2018 called How Putin's Oligarchs Funneled Millions into GOP Campaigns. It's got an amazing visual graphic with it that we'll provide on YouTube. But Dr. May, welcome to Beyond Politics.
Thanks, Matt.
You open it by describing a hard turn in 2015 through 2016 from a character that comes into the story named Len Blavatnik. Now, his political contributions soared. In your description, he suddenly, out of nowhere, pumped $6.3 million into Republican political action committees. Millions went to top Republican leaders like Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham. Could you tell us a little bit about what that episode was all about?
He was the needle in the haystack that I wasn't even looking for. We had been waiting to see who Trump would nominate as his new trade secretary. And when we found out that it was Wilbur Ross, he was serving as co-chair of the Bank of Cyprus with an oligarch handpicked by Putin. And I started getting a lump in my throat thinking, oh, dear God, Trump has appointed a guy to the cabinet that's in business with an oligarch. And I read a little further into the article and found that Victor Vexelberg, who I was familiar with because he owns a giant conglomerate in Russia that siphoned off a ton of money from the state. I thought, oh, God, he's a majority owner of the Bank of Cyprus. So here we are going to have a cabinet member. Our Secretary of Trade is in bed with the oligarchs. I started getting a sick feeling. Vexelberg's longtime business partner is Len Blavatnik. On October 25th, 2016, AI Alltep Holdings, a company reportedly based in New York and owned directly or indirectly by Vexelberg's partner, Len Blavatnik, made a $1 million contribution to Senator Mitch McConnell's Senate Leadership Fund. And I stopped breathing, was just frozen. I thought, it cannot be. There is no way Mitch McConnell would have taken $1 million from Len Blavatnik, who owns a Russian company, Vexelberg. It just can't be. A couple of weeks later, he had made a second $1 million donation. And that's when I realized, oh, dear God, they're already in the country. So that's when I realized we had an American conduit that is all you needed for the money to come from Russia through the American conduit into the PACs. And I started digging, and the more I dug, the worse.
Let me just zoom out for 1 second for a little piece of context to this connection to Wilbur Ross, Bank of Cyprus, Donald Trump, his cabinet. The author Craig Unger exhaustively documented this in several books, that Donald Trump started being cultivated by the KGB as an asset in the early 1980s, perhaps as early as 1977. And one thing that he was doing throughout the mid 1980s, and this continued for 30 years thereafter, was allowing the Russian mafia and Russian intelligence, and there's huge overlaps there too, who became the oligarchs here, allowing them to launder money through the Trump organization, launder money through real estate, through Trump Tower, by allowing shell companies to purchase properties. It essentially became, in Greg Olier's words, a Russian laundromat. And so it's, in a way, it's very surprising to discover that he's appointing Wilbur Ross to a cabinet position, since he was seemingly at the epicenter of another Russian laundromat for dirty money in the Bank of Cyprus. But in a way, it's not that surprising at all, because this is his MO. This is Donald Trump's longstanding MO. You take us from Blavatnik. He's a front man who can give money, who can legally give money to American political campaigns. And you connect from there to Oleg Deripaska. How does he tie in with Blavatnik and this nexus of oligarchs and Paul Manafort?
Where I think Deripaska is most important is where he links to Blavatnik. And that is that the two of them, plus Vekselberg, own together, the three of them own 69%, or they did at the time, the company called Rusal, which is the second largest aluminum producer in the world. It has since come under sanctions. It was essentially the nucleus of the cell. It was where everything came together. It was the core, because that's where Blavatnik really made his big money overseas in Russia, in that huge conglomerate with those two guys. And Deripaska, as we now know, is the right-hand oligarch to Vladimir Putin, because he takes direct orders from Putin, and he owns the company with Vatnik and Vekselberg, and the profits roll from that aluminum company, and they are transferred then from there overseas to here in the States to Blavatnik's holding companies, which are called Access Industries and AI Alltech. And that's where he gave the money. He gave the money in the names of his holding companies.
There's another name that comes in at this point, which is Konstantin Kilimnik. I'm going to flash up on screen the FBI wanted poster for him, because it's pretty spectacular. But he's looped into this as well because of the connection to Manafort. We know that Kilimnik, this is according to the Senate Intelligence report on this, the 5-volume Senate Intelligence report, volume 5. This is under Republicans, by the way. Republicans report this. They look into this and they say, Kilimnik is a Russian spook. He's attached to Russian intelligence. He and Deripaska meet with Manafort. They discuss a quote unquote Ukraine peace plan, because remember, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea back in 2014. There was the first military assault on Ukraine. And they discuss a peace plan, which means we get to keep everything we've taken and probably more. And Manafort in turn says, since I owe you a lot of money, Oleg, how about in payment in kind, you take some of this internal Trump campaign polling data you can then use to screw around further with our elections.
He and Manafort go way back into the 90s, when the Soviet Union first collapsed. There was a lot of money that poured in to Russia. There's a picture of him and Manafort when he was a lot younger. He was over here just like a little sponge, collecting any kind of information he could for Russia's security service as a young agent. And so he and Manafort struck up a relationship very early. and they work together in Ukraine. He's a conduit on the Russian side, just like I saw Blavatnik as a legal conduit on the American side. Klimnik was a legal conduit on the Russian side who could come and go and act as the courier or the conduit.
If people are wondering, what did the Russians get out of this? There's all kinds of proof that they got a lot. Around the time that this peace plan, we sound like Dr. Evil, lasers, around the time that this peace plan was being put forward from a Russian spook, lo and behold, Donald Trump says, quote, Putin did an amazing job of taking the mantle when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. He said, it would probably be okay if Russia just held on to Crimea. He said, the people of Crimea, from what I've heard, from whom I wonder, would rather be with Russia than where they were. And then his aides turned around and softened the Republican platform on Ukraine. You've invoked the name of Viktor Vekselberg. Can we just tie off? He's a third part of this troika that involves Blavatnik or Pascha.
He and Blavatnik go way back. They went to university together in Russia back in the 80s. They began to buy up energy companies, and their first project together was a gas company called TNK that eventually partnered very famously with British Petroleum. And so Vekselberg, his big conglomerate in Russia is known as Renova. That's their conglomerate. But Vekselberg, under that big holding company he has, one of his subsidiaries that he had at the time I wrote the story was Columbus Nova. I still have hard copies that I printed out because I had a gut feeling when all heck broke loose. The list that I printed out, which is no longer on the internet, everything was taken down.
Wow.
Listed Columbus Nova as, I'll read it here, the US-based investment arm of Renova Group. And so he sent money over to Columbus Nova that was then invested in US, real estate holdings or other capital investments, who knows what. But it was run by a cousin of his, Andrew Intrater.
Intrater starts to really thicken the plot here. Same darn pattern here. In this 2017 period, he develops a deep passion for Republicans. He loves Republicans. This is a poo platter of corruption. I'm going to let you pick. Okay. Here's number one. Go to Open Secrets or go directly to the FEC website. Look up Andrew Intrater. There are 86 contributions that you find there of public record. A public record. They all go to Republicans. They all suddenly sprout in this time frame. One exception. He makes a series of contributions to one Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard, who you may recall Hillary Clinton accused of being a Russian asset, and now spends most of her time spewing anti-Ukraine propaganda on Fox. Another place that Intrater shows up is he is the major financial benefactor of George Santos. Why? And then we've got this other fascinating Intrater piece, which is he paid Michael Cohen, the Trump fixer, $500,000 and proceeded in the course of 1 year to trade 1,000 text messages with him. I am very happily married, and I don't believe that I've traded 1,000 text messages with my wife in the span of 1 year, even though we're prolific texters. I could go on with this stuff, but Ruth, why don't you choose from the poo platter?
Okay.
What sparks your interest here?
Obviously, to start with, he grabbed my interest, as I said before, as a possible conduit for Vekselberg. And he did give $250,000 to Trump's inaugural. And he and Vekselberg attended Trump's inaugural. There are pictures of them there, which in hindsight is amazing that they would have the gall to show up and be photographed at the inaugural. But at that point, they hadn't been revealed. Now, Michael Cohen, the 500,000, people have speculated that money was to pay back the money used that went to Stormy Daniels to pay her off. Maybe so. My thinking is that may have been more like an advance payment that was going to go to Mr. Trump, as Cohen awfully said, to prime him, if you will, for some favors that Vexelberg was going to ask on behalf of Putin. That because there was a channel there. Vexelberg could go directly to Putin. You see a lot of photos of the two of them meeting. I think it was just prepayment, if you will, on favors that were to be asked.
You sum up in this 2015 to 2016 period, Blavatnik, Intrater, Shusterovich, and Kooks, the four individuals that you track who are American and eligible to legally make campaign contributions to American political candidates, made $10.4 million in contributions. That is a decent amount of money. And
Shusterovich, he gave $1 million out of just boom, out of nowhere.
Just out of nowhere. And they're tied into these oligarchs, particularly Vexelberg. So here's the other side of the coin. Maybe it's the best question of the whole thing. Why did these Republican PACs and these Trump-controlled funds take their money? They must have known. Why did they say yes?
That's the question that hung over my whole article. And I don't have an answer. It haunted me. It still haunts me. I think it haunts all of us to know how close the GOP, so many of them are, to these people, that they took the money. I gave the example of, who was it? It was Shusterovich, who tried to give money to the Bush campaign. And the RNC, they refused it back in 2000. They said, no, we're not going to take your money because you're too closely tied to the Russian government. Why didn't these GOP PACs do that in the 2015-2016 presidential race? That's what they should have done.
If you look at the giving pattern from Andrew Intrater for a second, his first on-record, publicly available contribution is 2017, $29,000 to the Republican National Committee. What was happening at the time? Mueller investigation, post-Comey firing. This is not exactly this is not a source that the Republican National Committee, while Donald Trump was in his first 6 months of his presidency, this is not a source they should have been taking money from. And they all go to top Republicans. It's a who's who. It's Tim Scott, Martha McSally, George Santos, Steve Scalise, Cory Gardner, John James, Lindsey Graham. I could go on and on through this. And he makes a modest effort. He lists his employer as Sparrow Capital, not as Columbus Nova. He certainly doesn't say, hey, this is Russian money. He's active. He's doing this. Let me ask you another major question that hangs over this. Why am I talking to you? And this in the best possible way, because you are an expert on the Russian and Ukrainian economies, these figures, the ultimate money sources. You're obviously an excellent sleuth. And at the same time, there's like investigative reporters in America who are supposed to be doing this full time as they're living. And you're not an investigative reporter. With all of this information being public record, you could find it. I could find some of it. Why weren't we hearing more of this nonstop from journalists?
That's a great question, Matt. It's a great question. And it drove me crazy, I have to tell you, because it's in early 2017, when I found that needle in the haystack, I thought, okay, next week, I'm going to turn on the TV And I'm going to hear about this. And I didn't. And I waited. I think there's three reasons. First of all, I don't know if you've heard of something called confirmation bias. People don't see what they don't expect to see. It's too bizarre. Secondly, is Trump was like a dog chasing a ball. He would take the ball out and throw it in one direction, and the press would all run that way. And before they could get to the ball, he'd take another ball and throw it that way, and then they'd all run after that. The real journalists are so overwhelmed. I need to step up as a reservist and just jump in there and write this because they're never going to get to it. And it's too big of a picture for them to see.
You step back and you say, don't we realize that all of this connects together? So it would not have taken a major effort to say, hey, folks, have we ever thought about the fact that Donald Trump was bankrupt and was bailed out with a $4 billion investment in Bayrock Capital? And so we know that he was owned lock, stock, and barrel at that point explicitly by Russian money. Even going back to, again, I mentioned the connection at the top of the show. Why was the Trump organization going out of its way in the 1980s to buy hundreds and hundreds of television sets from an electronics store that the FBI was investigating as a known hub of Russian intelligence and KGB activity? Why was that? It is a little weird to me that after seeing this profusion, this mushrooming out of the muck of Russian money popping up mostly among Republicans and Donald Trump, and this very overt interference in our elections, things went eerily quiet. Intrater suddenly pops up again, starting in 2020. He gives a bunch of money to Santos, but we're not seeing these same financial patterns that you unearthed. At the same time, there's a lot going on that has this eerie tip of the iceberg quality to it. There's Evgeny Prigozhin, who owns the Wagner Group, which is the tip of the spear of the Russian war effort in Ukraine. They're a private paramilitary group committing atrocities in Ukraine and around the world. Another Putin right-hand man. He's also the oligarch who bragged right after the 2022 midterms about Russia's ongoing efforts to interfere in US elections. He is the man responsible for that. That's a weird connection. And then we have this Charles McGonigal piece. Charles McGonigal, the chief FBI New York field office person in charge of counterintelligence, having to do with Russia, in charge of trying to put a stop to this stuff, goes and works for Oleg Deripaska. And it just spurs this question of what don't we know? What don't we know? What else is going on? What did that nest of FBI agents in New York have to do with this false exculpatory news article published in the New York Times, October 31st, 2016, a week before the election, with a headline that seemed to give Trump a clean bill of health, saying, investigating Donald Trump, FBI sees no clear link to Russia. I'm sorry for your students, are you fucking kidding me? After everything we've just gone through, no clear link to Russia? FBI? Are you kidding me? How worried are you about what we don't see, about the unknown unknowns?
I am equally worried about the dark money flowing into GOP, and I don't see any way to stop it. And that scares me. As far as the Russia link, I have to think that after all the blow up, the sanctions, the revelations of Trump's misconduct, that now hopefully the DOJ is looking into a lot of this. But we've taken so much wealth from the oligarchs since the war in Ukraine started. We've confiscated so much of their property along with our allies in Europe. I think they're laying pretty low. I think they're afraid of losing everything. honestly. Afraid Putin's going to lose. They all are really hoping that he'll get himself out of this war he's gotten himself into, because they see that it's destroying Russia's economy. It's destroying their ways, their means of increasing their wealth, of their credibility on a global scale. They really wish he'd get the hell out of there.
I do hope you're right that the combination of US sanctions and economic catastrophe, and unfortunately the war catastrophe, is tamping down a lot of this profusion of, I don't know how else to say it, Russian assault on us. We need to re-examine what went on there, because it begins to feel like a clock chiming for a 13th time. It's not only strange in itself, it calls everything else that underlies it into question. And if we see this kind of infiltration of the highest levels of law enforcement by the Russians and the highest levels of the Republican Party and our government leadership by the Russians, we have to wonder if we've caught all of the connections and we stamp them out. If there's a cancer, you got to get all of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then, of course, it does raise the question going forward of, we have another election upon us in a year. And a lot of these figures that have benefited from the Russian connection are still with us and or are trying to come back. And we have to be extremely vigilant about what they're going to be up to in the future. But on that note, that's, I guess, semi disquieting, maybe hopeful. Dr. Ruth May, thank you so much for doing this work, which I think is incredibly valuable, for bringing all of this explanation to our viewers and our listeners. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Matt.